So I watched ShannonQ's video with Michael Jones and Paul Ogia, yeah, Paul Ogia, on the Hiddenness of God. And it was an interesting stream. What they were dissecting was the Schellenberg version of the argument of the Hiddenness of God. Now, there were two versions that they talked about. The first one is premise one: if there is a God, he is perfectly loving. 2, if a perfectly loving God exists, reasonable non-belief does not occur. 3, reasonable non-belief occurs. Now, there's a problem with that version of it right there. But it's not really the crux of what gets discussed. If a perfectly loving God exists, then if there's a God, he is perfectly loving. 2, if a perfectly loving God exists, reasonable non-belief does not occur. Now, there's a problem with that right there. But that's not usually the crux of the argument. Obviously, a perfectly loving God might have perfectly good and reasonable reasons why they would keep somebody in the dark. So, it's not a great argument right from that premise right there. But the more important part of the argument is this: reasonable non-belief occurs. Now, they go on to talk about another way of framing it, which is more succinct and more to the point. Is there such a thing as non-reasonable? The second way it's framed gets right to the point. In the second framing that they talked about, if God exists, there are no non-resistant non-believers. Premise 2, non-resistant non-believers exist. Now, that is the crux of what the argument is trying to say. That there are non-resistant non-believers out there. Believers who are perfectly reasonable, perfectly amenable to the idea that God exists, and they're open to it, and they may even be looking, but God just doesn't show himself. Now, that's the crux of the argument, and that is highly debatable. First of all, point number 1. Before we start, though, if you are an atheist playing along at home, the thing that never gets mentioned in these Hiddenness of God arguments, which I feel I must say before we even start talking about it, is that the Bible makes perfectly crystal clear. Why this never really gets brought up, I do not know. That God is hidden. Says it in plain English. Surely you are God who hides his face. That's from the book of Isaiah. Then the Bible also makes perfectly crystal clear: seek ye the Lord while he can be found. Making clear what? The onus of seeking God is on you, the non-believer, 1. That's what the Bible's saying. I'm not saying it. I didn't say it. The Bible said it. I'm not defensive. You're the one being defensive. I didn't say it. The Bible said it. And 2, there's a window of opportunity. So the Bible makes perfectly crystal clear that God is hidden and that there is a window of opportunity wherein you can find him, and the onus is on you to seek him. So, in that sense, there really shouldn't be such a thing as the hiddenness of God argument. Why? Because the Bible says plain English: God is going to be hidden from you, and it's up to you to seek him out. And it also says, seek and you will find. Now, that's usually the crux of the point. Atheists will say, I did seek, and I didn't find, because he isn't there, there's no God. Now the question is there such a thing as non-resistant non-belief? That's the crux of these two framing arguments. Is there such a thing? Michael Jones says kind of no. And he talks about how your emotions are heavily invested in a certain outcome one way or the other. I myself, the problem with the argument as Schellenberg frames it, is that the person describing themselves as the non-resistant non-believer is the non-believer. So they're the ones saying that they're non-resistant. Call me skeptical. Call me skeptical. How do I know that you are non-resistant? You say to me, in good faith, I've sought God, and I didn't find because there is no God. How do I know that you are non-resistant and you sought God in good faith and just didn't find, just came up short? You see the problem? I'm relying on you to give me that information, and I'm more important than that, because I believe you sort of, is that I'm relying on you to do an accurate assessment of yourself, to perceive yourself accurately in your relationship to the proposition God exists or God does not exist. That's where you can call me skeptical. Because from my own experience dealing with a lot of atheists, that is not that common. Now, if there is such a thing as a non-resistant non-believer, to be perfectly fair, then Paul Ogia would actually be one. And there are a couple of people like him. He probably wouldn't be the closest thing to a genuine non-resistant non-believer. That would probably be objectively Dan. Now, this is just my own particular experience with the people. He is closest. Both of them are, if there is such a thing as someone who is perfectly open, amenable to the idea that God exists and would be perfectly open to reasonable evidence, those two are, there are examples of that in the atheist community. Those are the closest things to it. So, for example, with Objectively Dan, if I said, Dan, here's these prayers, these spiritual exercises that you can participate in, and then you read these 3 books. Pretty sure he would do it. Paul G would do it too, but he'd be a little bit like, he'd put on his like debunk hat. You know, a little bit. Not as much as the other guys. What is far more common than those two and people like them, far more common is what happened to me in one of the last videos that I posted about 3 weeks ago. I started saying this from the spiritual experience wherein the proposition God exists is derived. In other words, I went to a church and had a spiritual experience. And that is how a lot of people come to think, hey, wait, God does exist. They go to a church, they have a spiritual experience that's really powerful and compelling to them, and they go, hey, wait a minute. This does feel like God. Now, that's something that happens every single Sunday at my church. And 7 or 8, anywhere from 7 to 15 people become convinced by the spiritual experience that Sunday, every Sunday. The spiritual experience is real enough to them that they go, hey, wait a minute, this really does seem like God. This really is God. Now, I posted an explanation of that on YouTube, posted it on Twitter, and here's what one guy said. I'm not trying to diss this particular guy because this is indicative of a lot of the attitude in the atheist community. He said, easy to debunk. I was like, Holmes, you don't debunk an experience you have not participated in. But more importantly than that, and again, I'm not trying to diss that particular guy because it's indicative of a lot of the attitudes. Why would you want to debunk an experience you have not participated in? That's not honest inquiry. That's completely and utterly resistant. And that's where a lot more people are at in the atheist community than I expected to find. Somewhat shocking to me, as a matter of fact. See, when I started this by watching atheist YouTubers, and I thought, you know, I'll probably get along with atheists pretty well. And I was kind of right about that, because I kind of identify with the way they are. As a general rule, overgeneralizing, but as a rule, they tend to be more philosophical, more iconoclastic, and kind of free thinkers to a certain degree. So I thought I'd get along with them pretty well, and I was right about that. What I wasn't expecting is that they were going to be so resistant that they were going to see task number 1 as debunk, dismiss, discredit as soon as you open your mouth. Now, that isn't true of Paul Ogia, and it isn't necessarily true of Objectively Dan, but it is round the board true of at least 60% of the atheist community. You say, provide evidence. You start trying to explain to them how they could actually find God, and they'll start trying to quibble over every single solitary word. I had one guy, I posted a video, and this is the honest to God's truth. Didn't even listen to the entire video. Said there's no evidence for God. He wasn't talking to me, and I just kind of jumped in and said, here's some evidence, see what you think of this. Couldn't even get him to listen to the whole video. And he honestly came back with a rebuttal of every 30 seconds of conversation that came out of my mouth. I'm like, Holmes, that's not even close to giving somebody a fair hearing. He had some sort of counterpoint to every 30 seconds of my words. That's more common experience than your Paul Ogia or your Objectively Dan, who would actually listen. See, with Paul Ogia and Objectively Dan, what they do is they will actually listen to you and give you a fair hearing, and as long as you are saying things that they find eminently reasonable, they will tend to concur. As long as you stay away from things that they're going to object to, then they don't tend to object. That's not true around the boards of the atheist community. They'll object to every sentence that comes out of your mouth. Even things when they know exactly what you're talking. This guy objected to things he even knew exactly what I was talking about. He starts pretending he doesn't know what a prayer closet is. See a little bit later on Twitter, he knows exactly what a prayer closet is. I say 150% convinced that my experiences are real. Just a little phrase of mine, 150% convinced. He says something like, obviously your math skills aren't so bright. Yeah, ha, 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 obviously. That tends to be the operating way of atheists going about. They think their role is to, they've got it trained in them that the role is to debunk, dismiss, discredit, immediately start debating. That's walls. That's what that is. That isn't giving a fair hearing. Now, I get it that this is an arena wherein there's contested ground, and that's part of what we're doing on Twitter. But that's not non-resistant non-belief. It's not even close. And even Apologia and Objectively Dan, if they were going to honestly go to a place of a non-resistant non-belief, would have to pull away from the crowd a little bit and start honestly trying to seek on their own, search their heart. That's what the Bible is telling you to do. It says, I will be found of you if you search for me with all of your heart. Has nothing to do with arguments. Has nothing to do with debating other people. It's about your own experience and who you are as a human being and separating yourself from other people so you can get to a place where you may actually be able to hear from God. It's deeply spiritual, deeply personal, and it's unique to each individual. What's going to convince you isn't going to convince another person. Now, having said that, getting back to their video at hand, I mean, there's a lot to talk about in what they said. It was an interesting conversation. They kind of sidetracked a little into, I guess, inspiring philosophy believes that you get a second chance after you die. As nice as that is, I don't think a lot of people are on that same page. But it's not really that important what he thinks about how salvation, when he thinks that you can be saved. If he believes that you get a second chance after. That seemed to be what he was saying. It wasn't 100% clear. But one of the things that he said, and this is how a lot of atheists see belief. For example, if you think a lot of it is emotional investment. If you are emotionally invested in an outcome, your willingness to examine the evidence honestly or be led honestly is different than if you are not emotionally invested. And you can only be convinced they're really powerfully compelling in-your-face evidence. He used an example that kind of works where if you believe that your wife is faithful and loyal to you, it's going to be really hard to dissuade you of that belief, firmly ingrained in your heart, unless you see really powerful, compelling evidence. You come home one night and, she's in bed with another guy. Oh, smokes. My wife isn't faithful to me. Now, that's how a lot of atheists think that Christian belief or religious belief or God belief is supposed to occur. That God is supposed to deus ex machina on you and come in a way that's powerful. God knows exactly what it would take to convince me. So you set a really high bar for you to be convinced and consider it some sort of, great accomplishment of yours that you can disregard things that may actually lead you to God belief. But right there is the crux of the matter. That is not non-resistant non-belief. It's not even close. And the person who would be responsible for analyzing your resistance would be you. And as a general rule, people aren't that good at assessing their motivations and and understanding what they think and where they're coming from. They're really bad at it. They don't know their own hidden motivations. They don't understand their own hidden agendas. So, in other words, if I were to believe that my wife is faithful to me, it would take a really powerful sort of wake up. I come home and she's cheating on me. Oh, wow, I'm totally wrong. That's how a lot of atheists think God belief is supposed to come. A deus ex machina. God shows up and shakes your house and case closed. I'm here. I'm real. That's not how God belief is actually produced in most people. It's really not. And actually the idea that belief is a choice is a myth that floats around the atheist community. It is not true. It is only true in the rarest of rare circumstances. If I say there's a little pink elephant in the bedroom and you open the door and you don't see a little pink elephant, you can't choose to believe there is one. Okay, in that circumstance it's a choice. Or on the contrary, if I say there is a pink elephant, there isn't a pink elephant in the bedroom and you open the door and you see one, you can't choose to believe it. You can't choose to not believe it if you see it. But that's not how most beliefs occur in a human being. They aren't automatic, weird processes like that. Most beliefs come from you following a line of inquiry and pursuing it to its logical conclusion. That's how most of your beliefs come from. If they weren't placed in you by your family and your environment that you were raised in, if it's something that you actually came to believe by yourself, what happened was you followed a line of inquiry to its logical conclusion. So, for example, I honest to God believe, I've talked about this in other videos, but I honest to God believe that Hitler could have won World War II if he had gone straight through and taken Moscow. Instead, he divided his forces. Now, that is not only a choice of me believing that, that was a series of choices that produced that. It didn't just organically appear in me. I started reading books that were convincing on that particular topic, and I made decisions all along the way that brought me to that belief. Almost all of your beliefs are like that. They don't just appear automatically. Very rarely is it a like all or nothing proposition. There's a pink man in the bedroom and you don't see it or you see it. That's the rarest of rare circumstances. God belief is more like a process. And most atheists are busy cultivating non-belief constantly. You are doing things that aren't going to produce belief at all, aren't even going to come close. They're going to produce non-belief and more of it. So, for example, you turn on Atheist Experience and you watch Matt Dillahunty play with the true toy du jour. You know, here's the Dumbo Christian who believes the earth is 6,000 years old, and Matt Dillahunty runs circles around him for 20 minutes. And you go, woo! All you are doing is reinforcing your non-belief. You aren't honestly pursuing the equation, though. That's the point. You aren't honestly pursuing the proposition God exists. You are reinforcing your resistance to the proposition God exists. And furthermore, when there is an exaggeratedly Dumbo Christian, gee, coincidence of coincidences, he seems to make the rounds on the atheist channels. For example, Matt Powell. Not a single person thought he was convincing or anything other than something to put on the channel. So see, look how dumb these guys are. See, look how insane these guys are. That's reinforcing non-belief. And it's reinforcing it strongly, daily, constantly. It's actually building your resistance. So by the time you get somebody who's like, hey, look, I mean, that's the thing that I was shocked about. I wasn't shocked about, I thought I was going to get along with atheists pretty well, and honestly I usually do. Because the things about the way they tend to be that I tend to be cool with. They do tend to be iconoclastic thinkers, more often than not. It's why they became atheists a lot of the time. But the reinforcing of the non-belief constantly, I wasn't prepared for what that actually does in people. It produces ideological resistance. So that by the time you say, look, here's a couple of things that you haven't thought about, and they're bouncing all over you, trying to shut you down, debunk, dismiss, discredit you before you get 3 sentences out of your mouth. That's shocking. That was shocking to me. I wasn't prepared for that. That was something I was like, I can't believe people actually act like that. So, those are just some of my thoughts on the subject. Now, overall, on the hiddenness of God, is there such a thing as a non-resistant non-believer? There may be. But I am skeptical. Call me skeptical. Because the person who is responsible for reporting himself as non-resistant would be the non-believer himself. And I'll go into this in detail in videos to come. But there is a way that you can actually produce God belief in yourself fairly organically and fairly easily. Like any other type of beliefs, you follow a line of inquiry to its logical conclusion. You do it in a way that's preordained and set, and it's going to produce in you the actual conclusions. It's very, very similar with God belief. In other words, you learn how to connect spiritually. And then you practice connecting spiritually. I'll go into this in detail. And that's wherein the God belief actually comes from. It becomes organic to you, the human being. So, I'm not entirely sure that made sense. But that is all for now, kids. Mass is ended. Go in peace. Amen.